Stellar Blade is better than what people are saying. It is much greater than the sum of its parts, and it is being completely overshadowed by the dumbest controversy known to man. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Stellar Blade, and currently, it's my game of the year. Have I played better games this year? Probably, but there's something special about Stellar Blade, and I'm going to try to verbalize it in this video. I guess what I'm trying to say is, Stellar Blade is a beautiful mess, and I think I love it. I was late to the Stellar Blade train. My introduction to this game was in the State of Play showcase, rebranding it from Project Eve to Stellar Blade. My initial thoughts were probably similar to most people's. The first thing I noticed was, Eve's assets, and the second thing I noticed was its Sekiro-style parry mechanics. Sekiro is my favorite Souls game by a mile, so once I saw what the developers were cooking with this combat, I knew I just had to join the hype train. In preparation for this video, I went back and did some research on the game's origins. It seems like they had a pretty good idea of what this game was supposed to be. Stellar Blade's whole identity can be seen in this shot. Another Project Eve trailer straight up spoils one of the late game set pieces, and the 2021 trailer spoils most of the game. I'm getting ahead of myself. Stellar Blade was developed by Korean studio Shift Up. The studio was founded by Kim Hyung-tae, one of the illustrators who worked on the popular Korean MMO Blade and Soul. The studio has one other project to its name, a mobile game called Destiny Child. Destiny Child is a gacha game that was terminated by Shift Up not too long ago. It seems the game had die-hard fans, but I can't speak to its quality. I know very little about gacha games and what makes them good or bad. Looking at this gameplay trailer reminds me of the advertisements you get while trying to watch anime on sketchy sites. Even though the game is still available for download despite being shut down, I don't see myself putting any time and energy into it, honestly. In 2019, Shift Up announced another mobile title called Project Nike, The Goddess of Victory. This was announced alongside Stellar Blade, so I might give that one a try now that I know what the studio is capable of. Shift Up had quite a few collaborators throughout the development of Stellar Blade. Studio Monica lent them a few members to bring the game's sound to life, and boy god do they. Stellar Blade has one of my favorite video game soundtracks hands down. I can probably count on one hand how many games I've played where I enjoyed every single song. It's not surprising this game's soundtrack is so fire. Monica also composed the music for the Nier games. Both games evoke this feeling of beautiful loneliness with their soundscapes, and I just can't get enough of it. Shift Up also collaborated with Korean model Shin Jae-eun. Miss Shin's body was scanned and used as a base for the 3D model of Eve, the game's protagonist. The studio also used 3D scanning for its other characters, but unfortunately I cannot find any information on it. I don't want to touch on the controversy too much because it's fucking stupid, but there is currently some noise around the game's sexualization of its main character. Some people are happy that a character designed for the gaze of the cisgendered male is becoming popular. They hope this may swing the culture pendulum in the other direction and incentivize game studios to move away from a more inclusive definition of sexy. Of course, these arguments became something else entirely once some gamers found out that the game's content was toned down a bit in its day one update. Some of the more revealing costumes are no longer so, and there isn't as much gore. This censorship has caused some of the most annoying people to crawl out of their Twitter holes and start arguing over polygons. The director of the game has defended these decisions as well as his design of Eve, stating that since it's a third-person action game, the player will mostly be looking at Eve's back. So they spent extra time making sure that this view was appealing. This is kinda based, but as based as this is, I believe the criticisms of Stellar Blade's designs don't really hold weight until you realize the literal objectification of its characters. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Games like Stellar Blade deserve to exist. If a creator wants every single character in their creation to be a big titty, big bootied samurai android, then who are we to stop them? But that being said, if you're going to fill a game with eye candy, don't forget to give them sexiness in other ways too. Gaming publication The Gamer said in one of their articles, there was a feeling that evil sneaky games journalists would trash the game just because Eve was too sexy, but my problem is the opposite. She's not sexy enough. I agree with this wholeheartedly. You can put Eve in all these sexy outfits, but it's like drawing breasts on a rock. Yeah, some people might be okay with just the breast, but most people would prefer a living, breathing person with goals, aspirations, fears, a sense of humor, a personality. Eve is kind of just there for a good portion of Stellar Blade's runtime, and for those praising how sexy she is, I ask you to reflect. There is a lot more to sexiness than this, and Eve doesn't have those other things. The director tried to call out the double standard where games praise 2B from Nier Automata or lust over Bayonetta, and then proceed to trash Stellar Blade, but he's missing one important fact. 2B and Bayonetta are fully fleshed characters that also happen to be sexy, not just mannequins in sexy outfits. But to be fair, even if Eve is on the bland side, I would be lying if I said I didn't love her by the time I rolled credits. If one thing is for certain, Stellar Blade's combat is phenomenal. Combat and traversing the world is so much fun, and if that's what Shift Up prioritized, they succeeded. However, a word I keep seeing get thrown around is polished, and I don't know if I would agree with that. In my playthrough, I encountered a lot of bugs, not being able to grab ladders, not being able to use Blink, whatever this was. If people who referred to Stellar Blade as a polished title were only referring to the combat, then sure, I guess these Blink failures could be a skill issue. Unfortunately, Stellar Blade's gameplay is not just its combat. A common criticism of the game is that its platforming sections aren't fun, which I disagree with. They are fun, just buggy. The amount of times I've leaped towards ladders, ropes, and swinging bars just for Eve to clip through them is staggering in my 22 hours of gameplay. When the game receives its inevitable patches over the next few months, these problems will probably be fixed and the platforming criticisms won't hold weight anymore, in my humble opinion. Stellar Blade's combat, when it's working, is probably my favorite combat system of the last few years. It has a lot in common with the Dark Souls franchise, especially Sekiro. But the Soul-like influence doesn't stop here. I see aspects of Lies of P, Code Vein, even Jedi Survivor. Stellar Blade is a lot stiffer than Sekiro though. Its game feel feels more like Lies of P, but its stiffness comes from its skill tree and player comfort with its systems. As you play more of the game, you'll get more used to how Eve moves, but before you can relish your mastery of your character, you gain abilities to circumvent the stiffness of said movement. In retrospect, this design choice feels a bit counterintuitive. Stellar Blade wants you to get good, but it's a little scared that you might not be able to. It's scared to alienate some players by standing in its truth. Well, not when it comes to its character design, but definitely when it comes to game feel. Despite its Souls-like influence, it doesn't double down on Souls-like game design. There are difficulty options here, implicitly through gear, the WB pump mechanic, and exospines, but also explicitly through difficulty options. The game is incredibly easy for most of its runtime, but I still found myself having fun with it because I like Souls combat. Souls combat doesn't have to be difficult to be enjoyable. Nailing perfect parries and dodges is super satisfying. Would I feel more like a badass hitting a harder parry? Sure, but if I want that, I can just ignore the skill upgrade that makes defensive maneuvers easier. I don't want to turn this video into Dark Souls should have easy options and here's why. Honestly, that conversation is so disingenuous, played out, and boring, but the point I'm making is that I do like the fact that Stellar Blade gives the option to choose. Now, these options aren't perfect for those who need that challenge. The hard mode that unlocks after beating the game helps in a way, but since there are just so many options to make the game easier, it just won't land for some. Some players will always take the easier option if it's present. Maybe if the hard mode locked you to the most difficult versions of Blink, Repulse, Perfect Parry, and Dodge, then hard would be a great option for those looking for it. However, as it's currently implemented, frankly, it just isn't masochistic enough. These changes don't even feel far-fetched to me. In New Game Plus, the skill tree changes. Most of your skills get new animations and better scaling. Hard mode definitely could have gone in the other direction and forced players into mastering the game's combat. Honestly, difficulty is all subjective at the end of the day, but I'm here to talk about my experiences, so let me reiterate, this game is the easiest Souls-like I have ever played. At first, I was struggling to put in words why this game felt so much easier than the rest of the genre, and then it hit me. Since there's no stamina meter in Stellar Blade, you can just spam mobility and barrage enemies with combos until they die. With certain builds, you can trivialize combat entirely by just spamming beta and burst skills. These overpowered abilities interrupt enemy strings and sometimes even offer invincibility frames. The enemies of Stellar Blade just aren't equipped to deal with it, and honestly, if I were to describe the enemies of Stellar Blade in one word, it would be respectful. Where Souls games past Bloodborne have these flailing, aggressive enemies that seemingly never let you retaliate, Stellar Blade's enemies do their combo and wait patiently for you to respond. Even the bosses do this. Well, most of them, but we'll get to that. Stellar Blade's combat is like a action turn-based RPG. You can sit and respect the enemy's turn if you want to, but if you use the plethora of options available to you in the right ways, The enemies just kind of lay down and die. Maybe hard mode could have made them a bit more aggressive instead of just boosting health and damage numbers. And speaking of Stellar Blade's bosses, let's run through them. If I had to give a blanket statement right now, I would say the game's bosses are mostly good, but all of them except for one fall into the same pitfalls I've been expressing for the last few minutes. The tutorial boss is less of a boss fight, but more of a set piece. I think I would call this the Vanguard Demon of the game. It doesn't even matter if you beat it or not, and I anticipate most players to die here as they get used to the game. The second boss is the real tutorial. I like to refer to certain bosses and sections of games as gatekeepers. They are designed to stand in your way to make sure you understand the game's core mechanics. This boss has plenty of strings for you to parry, as well as yellow unblockable attacks for you to practice your dodging maneuvers. The boss even deploys the attacks you're supposed to blink through to make sure you're able to adapt on the fly. After Abaddon is the Corruptor, and this is the game's first misstep when it comes to boss design. Interesting to look at, but it feels more like a mini-boss than an actual boss. Maybe that was the intent and they just slapped a boss's health bar on an empowered enemy, but it just feels boring here. I don't know, perhaps it's just too simple, like most of the normal enemies. I don't know. The boss at the end of the 807 section of the game is the first real boss. He's aggressive and feels like an ego check. Like he's reminding you that this game is pulling punches and isn't afraid to throw a haymaker in every once in a while. This isn't to say he's a huge step up in difficulty or quality, but he's a definite shift. After him, there's Royal Guard Quiel. This isn't really a boss, just another skill check. The game is making sure your parries and dodges haven't gotten sloppy. This boss doesn't even get a boss health bar, but I call it a boss still because you have to beat her to progress the game. Quiel and her rematch later in the game are probably the worst fights because they come before these survival horror-esque sections of the game, where you don't even use your sword at all. At the end of the survival horror section, the game throws these Resident Evil throwaways at you. Despite their similarities to better Resident Evil bosses, I don't mind them here. They test you on an aspect of gameplay that the game hasn't really pressed you on. Many action game fans might become irritated because they bought Stellar Blade to play Stellar Blade, not Resident Evil, but I would argue that at least the first Maelstrom fight is good for pacing. I feel like the Stalker was Shift Up's attempt at a flailing boss, and they succeed for the most part. This is one of the few bosses that don't let up, and your windows to heal yourself are few and far between. I like this boss because I think these games are at their best when you and your opponent are both rapidly dancing across the battlefield trying not to let up. Right after Stalker, there's Juggernaut, and he's the complete opposite. The boss has these slow and devastating attacks, but honestly at this point of the playthrough, you shouldn't struggle with him at all. You probably have all of your movement options and multiple healing charges by this point, and since the boss is so slow, you have plenty of opportunity to heal yourself. This feels like a for fun boss, but if you called it terrible, I wouldn't blame you. Now, Tacky is one of my favorite bosses in the game. This fight is a turning point in the game's tone, and it makes a lot of sense since the enemies you fought in this area were taking over dead bodies. Everything is awesome about this fight. Its music is emotional and gorgeous. Everything is awesome about this fight. Its music is emotional and gorgeous. The detail in the boss arena and how the smoke clears with each massive swing from Tacky's blade is just wow. After defeating Tacky, you also get some sapphic undertones for my women who love women out there. More on this later. Take a shot every time I say more on this later. You'll be dead before the video finishes. Belial is probably also one of my favorite bosses in the game when it comes to visuals, but outside that, it's just a fun fight. It's also the only boss that runs from you after you clear its first phase and then returns later to finish the fight. It has this regeneration gimmick that doesn't really mean anything because it's just super easy to deal with. This boss is probably easier by design because you have to kill it a few times to actually kill it, but I wish they would have gone into another direction. Maybe after Eve cuts its arm off, it never regenerates, and then Belial comes back with a new moveset adapting to the missing arm. It would throw off the players who took the time to learn his moveset, especially if the moveset is similar but just different enough that muscle memory wouldn't be enough to beat him. I don't know, this boss isn't bad, just had a lot more potential. Katakuri and Demo Crawler are my favorite bosses in this game. These two bosses are when Shift Up locked the fuck in. Katakuri's such an interestingly designed creature and has some excellent tricks up its sleeve to give it the edge in combat. At this point you're in the endgame, so by now you've probably established your build. Katakuri has a move that completely removes a good chunk of your offensive options for a short period. Demo Crawler, on the other hand, is much more in line with the rest of the game's bosses in terms of depth, but it looks so much cooler. Mechanical angel imagery is so fire, and the set piece of firing a makeshift railgun while falling to earth is chef's kiss. I made a joke about this on Twitter. I really just couldn't imagine finishing these two fights and then saying, yep, this game is kinda mid, 7 out of 10. As for the unidentified Natiba, there really isn't much to say about it. The fight is challenging, probably the first real challenging fight in the game, and the fight also introduces these boss insta-kill moves. Natiba will begin charging up a super move, and the player has to destroy a few targets with their drone gun before the charge finishes. While lining up your shots, Natiba still attacks you, keeping that pressure applied, and I really like how the game handles this. Unfortunately, these attacks are only used a few times in the endgame. I think most bosses should have had something like this. It could have been a cool twist on a gank fight. Having to split your attention between multiple targets isn't used in this game much, but I feel like if Shift Up would have leaned a bit more into this design, it could have been really cool. After Natiba, it's Raven. And after I completed the game, I searched around to see how other players were feeling about the difficulty, and it seems like most players were split when it came to the title of hardest boss in the game. Some players, including gaming publications, believe it's the last boss of the game. Others believe it's Raven, and so do I. I died more times to this boss than I did throughout the rest of my playthrough. Raven is my favorite boss in the game, and to me, she is definitely the hardest. My enjoyment of Raven is tied to my love of humanoid boss fights, but on top of that, I feel like I wasn't really pushed to my limits anywhere else in the game. The cheesing strategies that work on every other boss, including the final one, don't really work on Raven. She parries you sometimes, she counters your beta attacks, and she's so aggressive, failing a parry or dodge spells certain death. I'm pretty sure she reads your inputs as well. I could just be unlucky, but every single time I tried to heal, she would just wind up an attack, most of which I was unable to deal with. The only way I could consistently heal in this boss fight was by using the pulse grenades to knock her away and then healing during her recovery animation. I'm very excited about this game's upcoming boss rush mode, but I hope it allows you to just pick any boss and fight them over and over again. I really want to master this fight. Unfortunately, the bosses after Raven aren't as good. The final boss depends on what ending you get. There are 3. In my playthrough, I 100%ed the game. I did every request, every side quest, and collected every single can. So I got the true ending and the Providence boss fight. This fight was a bit underwhelming to me. It was fine to fight, sure, but I was hoping for something a bit grander in scale. Raven had much more mechanical depth, and the demo crawler was much more cinematic. Shift Up just dropped the ball on this one, especially when compared to the Elder Natiba fight. I personally haven't fought this boss yet because Shift Up had the genius idea to only have one active save slot, so after I made my choice at the end, I was locked into the Providence fight. I know that the game doesn't autosave after the choice unless you die, but of course I was going to die. I had no idea what the final boss was capable of. I've watched some amazing no-hit runs of the fight just to get an idea for the video, and yeah, why wasn't this the true final boss? I mean, I know why, but the things that happened in the story could have still happened with these bosses swapped. Hell, they could have removed the initial Adam fight entirely, especially since he doesn't really fight you anyway. A lot of the mess and the beautiful mess that is Stellar Blade comes from these endings to me. All of the pieces for an epic send-off to these characters are present here, but Shift Up just completely fumbles the bag. All in all, the Stellar Blade bosses are a mixed bag for sure, but I would see it more so like a mixed bag of your favorite candy with a few rocks tossed in. All my criticisms aside, I love this game still. I was able to find beauty in its awkwardness, but don't get it twisted, this story is awkward in a way that seems like it knows what it wants to be, but it doesn't know how to be it. The characters are trying really hard to sell their personalities to you, but it falls flat in a way I can only describe as awkward. The female characters all feel like they were meant to be eye candy and weren't given any flesh to their personality. It's a bit ironic, the game is trying to ask what makes something human while making sure all its characters are as robotic as possible. The male characters don't get the same treatment, most of them don't even have faces. The men are literally in this game to just talk at you while you're slowly panning your camera around Eve. I brought this up near the beginning of the video. This mishandling makes the female characters feel like literal objects for you to goon over while the men are in there just to give an illusion that this is a normal video game. Also, I'm not sure if Eve was intended to be autistic coded, but the more I think about it, the more I see an argument for it. You could argue that she just doesn't know anything about humans and their social norms, and that's why she's so socially awkward. But come on, look at how hyped she is after finding a can. Adam embodies the problem with the men of Stellar Blade by truly just being walking exposition. Adam is more like a car GPS that won't shut up than a character, and it makes his reveal at the end not have any weight because I don't know who Adam is, and he's with us for the entirety of the game. The databank in the start menu tries to provide extra context, but honestly, it just isn't enough. Lily has the same issue. It's like she's trying her hardest to be a lovable character, but fails at every opportunity. Her voice acting is also the worst of the 3 in my opinion, but upon revisiting cutscenes for this section of the video, I think her direction was just bad. Or the script. Or both. Speaking of the databank, it does a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to this game's characters and world design. It even does a good job for some of the characters, but all this tells me is that they either ran out of time or opted to put more important story aspects in the databank. Or maybe they just never prioritized a good story to begin with. My only question is, how are you going to try to copy one of the greatest stories of modern gaming without putting any real effort into the story? The story of Stellar Blade doesn't even begin with the opening sequence of the game. It begins in a motion comic the developers released before the game. This comic doesn't give us any new information that couldn't be inferred from what happens in the game. However, it does fuel this romantic tension between Taki and Eve. I don't know if the developers intended for them to be romantically involved, because here it's obvious that there's some chemistry, while in the game, if someone said Taki is more of a big sis or mentor to Eve, I wouldn't argue with them. After rolling credits on Stellar Blade, I feel like maybe this game shouldn't have had a story at all. What if the game was just about Eve exploring an Earth on its last legs? What if the game just allowed players to do a bunch of quests just to make the world livable? Stellar Blade is at its best when it's being itself, when it's exploring Eve's journey into learning human culture, when it's letting you do flashy combos on its bosses, when you're fishing in a beautiful oasis with the game's OST perfectly setting the vibe. This game didn't need a story, in my opinion. The world is interesting, and I had a lot of fun reading the data entries, solving puzzles, and gathering collectibles. I mean, I wish there was a little bit more level variety, but I'm content with what we received. There's so much potential here, potential that I hope Stellar Blade 2 capitalizes on. Theodore Roosevelt said comparison is the thief of joy, and I feel like a lot of the game's criticisms comes from comparing it to Nier. That isn't the player's fault. The game itself was trying its hardest to be Nier. A sequel is pretty much guaranteed at this point, and I hope the developer learns that most of us love this game when it's being itself. Give us less Nier and give us more Stellar Blade. Dedicate the time to actually flesh out Eve, Lily, and any other characters that may be introduced. It's okay to alienate some of your players instead of trying to appeal to the widest audience possible. Please, for the love of God, remove these cover-to-cover stealth sections. What happened here? All in all, I believe there's something special in this game. It could have been more than its sex appeal. It could have been more than a Nier clone. The game just needed a little bit more confidence to stand on its own 2 feet. You have our attention shift up, so what will you do with it?